My name is Harper Reynolds. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my life, I've worked in spaces where order matters more than volume. Administration, records, trusts, the quiet infrastructure people only notice when it fails. I've never had a title that impressed anyone at dinner parties. I've never been introduced as the powerful one. More often, I'm described as steady, dependable, or my least favorite word, easy. People tend to underestimate me, not aggressively, not cruelly. It's softer than that. They assume I won't push back, that I'll defer, that I'll accept explanations instead of asking for proof. I've learned that underestimation doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from habit. And habits, when left unchallenged, can rewrite reality. This story isn't dramatic in the way people expect. There are no shouting matches, no last-minute rescues, no triumphant speeches. What happened unfolded slowly, through documents, assumptions, and one detail that never quite fit, but that everyone agreed to ignore. Everyone, that is, except me. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I'm not telling this story to embarrass anyone. I'm not telling it to claim moral superiority, and I'm certainly not telling it to relive old wounds for sympathy. I'm telling it because the truth deserves to exist without decoration, and because silence, when it's misunderstood as consent, can do real damage. At the center of this story is a family trust, a signature, and a fact that was known but inconvenient. My mother lost the use of her right hand years earlier. It was documented, it was discussed, it was accommodated, and yet, somehow, her signature appeared on a legal document long after she was physically capable of writing it. Everyone had an explanation. Everyone was comfortable moving on. I wasn't. What follows is not a story about confrontation. It's about observation, about what happens when you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from not understanding you. It's about patience, not the passive kind, but the deliberate kind. The kind that watches, records, and waits for the right moment to let the facts speak on their own. There will be moments in the story that feel quiet to the point of discomfort. That's intentional. Because real power shifts rarely announce themselves. They happen in offices with neutral walls, in conversations that sound polite, in professional assessments that take minutes and undo years of pretense. A handwriting analyst ended the charade in minutes. But the truth didn't begin there. It began long before, with how I was seen, how I was used, and how invisible I was expected to remain. I stayed quiet for a long time. Not because I didn't know what was happening, but because I understood something others didn't. Once you speak, people prepare their defenses. When you wait, they keep making mistakes. I'm sharing this now for anyone who has ever felt underestimated in their own family, their own workplace, or their own story. For anyone who was trusted with responsibility but denied credibility. For anyone who was told, gently, that they were imagining things. So before we continue, I want to ask you something, honestly and without pressure. Have you ever sensed that the most important truths in your life were being protected by your silence, and wondered what would happen if you stopped carrying them alone? To the people around me, I was uncomplicated. That's the word I heard most often, usually said with a kind of relief. Harper's easy. Harper doesn't mind. Harper will handle it. I was the person copied on emails just in case, the one asked to take notes, to follow up, to make sure things didn't slip through the cracks. I was present in almost every important moment, yet somehow absent from the story people told about those moments later. In my family, that role had been assigned early. I was the observant daughter, the practical one, not the emotional center like my mother once was, not the charismatic presence my siblings carried so effortlessly. I was the one who remembered dates, appointments, and medications, the one who knew where the documents were kept, which lawyer handled which matter, what had been signed, and when. It was never framed as power. It was framed as helpfulness. And I accepted it because it felt useful, necessary even. After my mother lost the use of her right hand, the family reorganized itself around her limitations. At least, that's how it looked on the surface. There were accommodations, conversations, and careful gestures of concern. People spoke for her when she grew tired. Someone else filled out forms. Someone else studied papers while she dictated. I became part of that quiet machinery, listening, remembering, making sure nothing important was forgotten. Over time, that turned into an assumption. Harper will keep track. Harper will notice if something's wrong. And if she doesn't say anything, everything must be fine. In professional settings, it wasn't much different. I wasn't underestimated in a loud way. No one dismissed me outright. That would have required effort. Instead, I was gently overlooked. Decisions happened in rooms I wasn't invited into, even when I had assembled the information that made those decisions possible. My name appeared in footnotes, not headlines. I was thanked privately and ignored publicly. What I learned, slowly, was that invisibility can feel like safety, until you realize it's also exposure. Because when people stop seeing you as a person with agency, they start seeing you as a function, a resource, something dependable but replaceable, something that doesn't object. By the time the trust entered the conversation, my role was already defined. I was there to organize, not to question, to facilitate, not to interpret. The adults, because that's how they still thought of themselves in relation to me, handled the real decisions. I handled the paperwork around them. No one ever said Harper wouldn't understand. They didn't need to. They said, Harper, we'll make sure it's all filed correctly. And I did. I noticed things, of course. I always did. Discrepancies in dates, language that felt copied from older documents without being fully adjusted. A signature that looked off. Not dramatically, not enough to alarm someone who didn't already know what to look for. Enough that my eyes paused every time they passed over it. But pausing isn't the same as speaking. At that stage, I still believed that if something were truly wrong, someone else, someone more authoritative, more visible, would catch it. That was the quiet lie I told myself. My role was to support the system, not challenge it. That trust, once formalized, didn't need scrutiny from someone like me. And so, to them, I remained exactly who they expected. The helpful daughter, the reliable presence, the one who didn't complicate things. They didn't see me as passive. They saw me as compliant. There's a difference, but it's subtle enough that people rarely examine it. Compliance is comfortable. It keeps things moving. It doesn't demand justification. Looking back, I can see how neatly I fit into that shape. How often I made myself smaller to keep things smooth. How often my silence was interpreted as agreement, not restraint. At the time, I thought I was being considerate. Now I understand I was being categorized. And once someone decides who you are to them, they stop listening to anything that contradicts it. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's why it stayed with me. It happened during a routine meeting at my uncle's office. One of those spaces designed to feel neutral but heavy with implication. Framed certificates, leather chairs, and a polished table that reflected everyone's hands when they rested on it. We were reviewing documents related to the trust. Nothing dramatic, nothing contentious, or so it seemed. I was there to take notes. That was understood without being said. As the pages were passed around, I noticed a line item that referenced an amendment date I didn't recognize. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people gloss over because it doesn't change the spirit of the document, only its timeline. I waited until there was a pause in the conversation, then spoke carefully. I don't remember us discussing this revision, I said. Was there an addendum signed later? The room didn't stop. It barely slowed. My uncle glanced at the page, then at me, with a polite smile that carried no curiosity. It was handled, he said. Nothing for you to worry about. Nothing for you to worry about? Nothing to clarify, not a good question. Just a gentle dismissal, wrapped in reassurance. The conversation moved on. Pen scratched. Someone poured more coffee. I wrote the date down anyway. That was the cut. Not the dismissal itself, but how easily it happened. No one looked back to check whether my concern had merit. How quickly the system closed around the assumption that I was there to assist, not assess. Later in the hallway, one of my cousins laughed lightly and said, "You always catch the tiniest things. If we stopped for all of them, we'd never finish." It was meant as a compliment. I smiled because that's what was expected. But something in me recalibrated. Not loudly, just a small internal shift. The realization that attention, when it's inconvenient, is treated like a flaw. From that point on, I started noticing how often this pattern repeated. I'd ask a question and receive an answer that didn't quite answer it. I'd flag a detail and be told it had already been taken care of, always kindly, always without malice, and always with the unspoken message that my role was to keep things moving, not slow them down with precision. The thing about small cuts is that they don't bleed much. You don't rush to treat them. You assume they'll heal on their own. But they change how you move. I began to hesitate before speaking, not because I doubted myself, but because I could predict the outcome, the polite deflection, the subtle reminder of my place. I told myself it wasn't worth disrupting the flow over something that probably had an explanation. Probably. What no one else seemed to notice, or care to notice, was that explanations were never documented. They lived in conversation, not in writing. They relied on trust, not verification. And trust, in a family like ours, was something you were expected to extend upward, not laterally. That was the first time I realized something else, too. Being ignored is not the same as being wrong. But when you're the only one who remembers what was said, what was signed, what was physically possible at a certain point in time, you start to carry a quiet burden. You begin to wonder whether precision is worth the social cost, whether clarity is worth being seen as difficult. I chose silence again, not because I didn't feel the cut, but because I was still trying to believe it was accidental. Silence has a way of becoming routine. After that first dismissal, I told myself it was an isolated moment. Everyone misses something once in a while. Everyone is allowed to wave off a detail if they believe they have a broader view. That's what I said to myself when similar moments followed, close enough in pattern that I should have recognized them sooner. But repetition has a numbing effect. Each time I raised a question, the response was consistent. Not defensive, not hostile, just final. It's handled. We've already accounted for that. You're thinking too far into it, and always delivered with the same tone reserved for someone being gently guided back into their lane. Over time, I stopped expecting engagement. I learned to phrase my observations as suggestions instead of concerns. Then, as passing comments. Then eventually, not at all. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through familiarity. When being overlooked happens often enough, it starts to feel like the natural order of things. You adjust yourself to fit it. You tell yourself you're being adaptable, mature, cooperative. I did all of that. I told myself that families operate on trust, not audits. That questioning too much could create tension my mother didn't need. That my role was to keep the peace, not disturb it with technicalities. After all, nothing bad had happened yet. Nothing had been lost. Nothing had exploded. That's the trap. We wait for damage to justify concern, forgetting that prevention rarely announces itself. There were moments when I almost spoke up again, when the signature caught my eye in a way that made my stomach tighten. My mother's handwriting had always been distinctive, looped but controlled, pressure uneven after the injury, letters compensating for a hand that no longer responded the way it once had. The signature on the trust was smooth, confident, unbroken. I noticed. I always noticed. But I also noticed the social cues that followed any deviation from compliance. The slight tightening of smiles, the way conversations ended sooner, the unspoken suggestion that I was being overly cautious, maybe even distrustful. In a family that valued harmony, distrust was the real offense. So I learned to rationalize. Maybe she dictated it. Maybe someone guided her hand. Maybe it was signed earlier and dated later for administrative reasons. Each explanation was plausible enough to quiet my instincts, especially when no one else seemed concerned. And there's a strange pressure in being the only person who sees a problem. You start to wonder if the problem is your perception, not the situation. I became very good at that kind of self-doubt. What I didn't realize at the time was that my silence was being interpreted, not as thoughtfulness, but as confirmation. Every meeting I attended without objection reinforced the belief that everything was in order. Every document I filed without comment became another layer of legitimacy. I was helping normalize something I didn't agree with, and yet I stayed. Part of me believed that if I kept watching, I'd eventually understand the full picture. That clarity would arrive naturally. Another part of me was afraid of being wrong, of accusing without proof, of fracturing relationships that had already been strained by illness and responsibility. So I did what many people do when they feel uncertain but obligated. I minimized myself. I told myself that being quiet was the mature choice, that restraint was wisdom, that my discomfort was the price of stability. Looking back, I can see how neatly that reasoning served everyone but me. Because while I was normalizing the disrespect, it was also normalizing the lie. And once a lie becomes routine, it no longer feels like deception. It feels like tradition. Roles don't arrive with announcements. They settle in quietly, through repetition. By the time I recognized mine, it had already hardened into expectation. I was the reliable one, the person who showed up early and left last, the one who knew which folder held which version of a document, who remembered the names of attorneys' assistants, who followed up without being asked. Reliability, I learned, is a double-edged thing. It earns you trust, but it also earns you invisibility. Because once people trust you to handle the details, they stop imagining you might question the decisions. In my family, this role came with a particular kind of praise. We couldn't do this without you, Harper. You're such a help. You're so good at keeping things organized. It sounded like appreciation. It felt like an obligation. None of those compliments came with authority. None came with a seat at the table where meaning was assigned. I wasn't asked what I thought. I was asked what needed to be filed, and I complied because that was the role. My mother, for her part, rarely contradicted this arrangement. After the injury, she grew tired more easily. She trusted the people around her to manage what she no longer could. I don't blame her for that. Trust is exhausting to renegotiate when your body has already betrayed you once. She believed the family would protect her interests. She believed the system would function as intended. So did I for a long time. What no one acknowledged, what no one wanted to acknowledge, was that systems only work when someone is willing to question them, and the person assigned to keep things smooth is rarely encouraged to do that. There was an unspoken hierarchy in every interaction. Older relatives spoke. Professionals explained. I listened and recorded. When I did speak, it was to clarify logistics, not intent. I was a translator of decisions, not a participant in them. Once, during a call with a legal advisor, I asked whether my mother had been physically present when a particular document was executed. The question was neutral, almost clinical. The response was immediate. Let's not get into hypotheticals, he said lightly. Everything was done appropriately. It was the same word again and again. A word that sounded definitive without offering evidence. A word that closed conversations. After that, I stopped asking questions out loud. Instead, I started listening differently. I paid attention to what was said quickly, as if rehearsed, to what was brushed past, to the moments when my presence seemed to make people slightly more careful with their language, and the moments when it didn't. They still saw me as harmless. That was the irony. My silence didn't elevate me in their estimation. It confirmed their assumptions. They believed they understood me completely, that I was loyal, diligent, and non-threatening. They were wrong about one thing. I wasn't non-threatening. I was observant. But observation without acknowledgement is easy to dismiss. It doesn't challenge anyone's self-image. It doesn't force accountability. It simply waits. At the time, I thought waiting was patience. I thought I was being responsible, respectful, adult. What I didn't see was that I had been assigned a role that depended on my restraint to function. The reliable one, the quiet one, the one who would never push. That was who I was to them. And because they believed that so completely, they never noticed when something inside me began to shift. The shift didn't come during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic reveal. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, alone. I was at my kitchen table, sorting through copies of documents I'd accumulated over the years. Old habits die hard. The light was fading, the kind that turns paper slightly blue at the edges. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was organizing, the way I always did, aligning dates, matching versions. And then I noticed something I couldn't unsee. It wasn't the signature itself. I'd seen that dozens of times. It was the sequence, the order in which documents had supposedly been signed. A form dated after my mother's injury referenced a prior acknowledgement that required a handwritten confirmation. Not a proxy, not a verbal authorization, a handwritten mark. I sat very still. For the first time, I didn't rush to explain it away. I didn't reach for a charitable interpretation. I didn't tell myself there was a reasonable administrative workaround I simply wasn't aware of. Instead, I asked a different question, one I had avoided for years. What if this wasn't a misunderstanding? That question landed quietly, but it changed everything. I thought about my mother's hand, the way it rested now, fingers curled slightly inward, muscles unresponsive. The months of therapy, the adaptations she'd learned to live with. Writing had been one of the first things she lost. Not gradually, completely. There was no scenario in which she could have produced that signature at that time. The clarity didn't bring anger. It brought focus. I realized that I had been waiting for permission to be certain, for someone else to validate what I already knew. And that permission was never going to come, because certainty threatened too many comfortable narratives. So I stopped waiting. That evening, I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even write anything down beyond what already existed. I simply acknowledged the truth to myself without apology. From that moment on, silence stopped being the default behavior. It became a decision, a strategic one. I understood then that speaking too early would collapse everything into defensiveness and denial. I would be framed as emotional, suspicious, and disruptive. The facts would be buried under tone and intent. But facts, when handled correctly, don't need volume. They need precision. So I changed how I moved through the world. I became more attentive, not less. More agreeable on the surface, more invisible in the ways that mattered to them. I asked fewer questions and listened more closely. I documented everything quietly, methodically. They thought nothing had changed. They were wrong again. Something fundamental had shifted inside me, not into bitterness, not into rage, but into clarity. And clarity has a way of simplifying decisions that once felt impossible. I no longer needed their explanations. I needed the truth to stand on its own. Once you recognize silence as an option, it stops being passive. After that afternoon at the kitchen table, I didn't withdraw. I refined. I spoke when spoken to. I nodded at explanations I already knew were incomplete. I continued to file, to organize, to attend meetings. On the surface, nothing about my behavior suggested resistance. That was the point. People are remarkably honest when they believe you agree with them. When they think you're aligned, they stop guarding their language. They fill in gaps without realizing it. They reveal assumptions they would otherwise protect. I listened. I noticed how often the trust was referred to as settled, despite ongoing amendments. How my mother's involvement was spoken of in the past tense, even when her name was still being used in the present. How phrases like, "she was comfortable with this," replaced direct quotes or written confirmations. Silence gave me access. When I had spoken up before, I had been met with closure. When I stopped, conversation stayed open. People explained more than they needed to. They answered questions I didn't ask. They mistook my quiet for acceptance. Internally, I was making distinctions between what was assumed and what was documented, between what was claimed and what could be proven. I stopped trying to reconcile inconsistencies emotionally. I treated them analytically. This wasn't about catching anyone out. It was about understanding the structure of the situation clearly enough to act without error. I also began to prepare for something else: disbelief. I knew that if I ever spoke, I would not be believed immediately. Not because the facts were weak, but because the narrative was strong. Families especially resist revisions to stories they've told themselves for years. Any challenge is perceived as an attack, regardless of tone. So I didn't challenge, I gathered. I made copies of documents and noted their sources. I traced timelines without commentary. I preserved emails and meeting notes that referenced decisions without evidence. Everything I collected already existed. I simply brought it into one place, organized in a way no one else had bothered to do. This work was quiet, methodical, almost boring, which is why it worked. No one becomes defensive about someone who appears uninvested. No one monitors the movements of someone they believe is still playing their assigned role. I was still the reliable one, the helpful one, the person who would never cause trouble. They never noticed that my silence had changed in texture. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was a restraint. There's a difference between not speaking because you're afraid and not speaking because you're choosing the moment. One is self-erasure, the other is control. I didn't feel powerful, That's not how it registers at first. I felt calm, focused, grounded in something solid for the first time in years. The truth didn't feel urgent anymore. It felt inevitable. All I had to do was let the right person see it. What they never noticed was how much space their assumptions gave me. They thought preparation would look like confrontation, like sudden distance, like questions that came too fast or eyes that lingered too long. They were watching for emotional shifts, not procedural ones, for anger, for rebellion, for anything that fit the story they already knew how to handle. What they weren't watching for was discipline. I didn't announce anything to myself either. I didn't say, "Now I prepare." I simply adjusted my standards. If I were going to continue being the person who handled details, then I was going to handle them correctly, completely, without interpretation, without trust, filling in gaps that documentation should have covered. I started with timelines, not narratives. Timelines don't care about intent. They care about sequence. I listed every document related to the trust, every amendment, every reference conversation. I noted dates, locations, witnesses, and methods of execution. When something relied on memory rather than a record, I marked it as such. When something conflicted with physical reality, I let the conflict stand without commentary. Facts don't need help. They need an arrangement. I also paid attention to language. The way people spoke about my mother's consent was revealing. Phrases like, "she was on board" or "she agreed with the direction" appeared frequently, but always without direct evidence. No written confirmation, no recorded statement, just confidence, the kind that assumes no one will ever ask for more. I didn't ask. I learned instead. Quietly, I educated myself. Not in dramatic ways. I didn't enroll in courses or announce new interests. I read professional articles late at night. I familiarized myself with standards, what constituted valid consent, what handwriting analysis could and couldn't establish, and how legal professionals evaluate authenticity when physical limitations are involved. I learned what questions experts ask when no one is trying to impress them. Most importantly, I learned patience. Preparation isn't about speed, it's about reducing error. Every piece of information I collected was cross-checked. Every assumption I had once made was removed. If something couldn't be verified, it wasn't included. This wasn't a case I was building. It was a record I was restoring. And still, outwardly, I remained the same. I attended gatherings. I made small talk. I listened to people describe the trust as settled and done, while adding new layers beneath it. I was included in logistics and excluded from meaning, exactly as before. They didn't notice that I had stopped explaining myself because they never expected me to explain anything important in the first place. There's a particular freedom in being underestimated, this completely. No one rushes you. No one interferes. No one imagines you're capable of altering the outcome. I wasn't altering it. I was clarifying it. The truth was already there. All I was doing was making it visible enough that it could no longer be smoothed over with tone or authority. When the time came, and I knew it would, I didn't want to be the loudest voice in the room. I wanted to be the last one speaking. The private reveal didn't feel triumphant. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of victory, just a quiet, steady confirmation that what I had suspected was not only real, but clearly demonstrable. The kind of clarity that settles into your body rather than electrifies it. It happened when I laid everything out side by side, not as a stack, but as a sequence. Dates aligned, signatures compared, language tracked across versions. When viewed individually, each document looked unremarkable, acceptable, ordinary. But together, they told a different story, one that relied on a single fragile assumption, that no one would ever examine the handwriting. My mother's injury had been well documented medically. Occupational therapy notes, adaptive accommodations, statements acknowledging her inability to write with her right hand. All of this existed independently of the trust. No one had thought to reconcile the two worlds, the medical reality and the legal fiction. That reconciliation was the leverage. I didn't share this realization with anyone, not even myself in words. I simply sat with it, letting the weight of it settle. Because leverage isn't about what you hold. It's about when and how you choose to apply it. What struck me most was how unnecessary the deception had been. There were legitimate alternatives. proxy signatures, recorded consent, court oversight. Any of those would have held. Instead, someone had chosen the path that assumed compliance and obscurity. They assumed wrong. Still, I didn't act immediately. I understood now that the strength of this truth lay in its independence. I couldn't be the one to declare it. If I did, it would be framed as personal, emotional, motivated. The truth needed to arrive from somewhere else. So I asked myself a single practical question. Who would see this without context, without loyalty, without discomfort? The answer was simple. A professional, not a family advisor, not someone who knew our history, someone whose job was to look at writing and assess nothing but form, pressure, and continuity. Someone who could say, within minutes, what had taken me years to accept. I didn't feel excitement at the thought. I felt relief, because once the truth was in someone else's hands, it would no longer be something I had to carry alone. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in a long while, not because anything had changed yet, but because I finally knew what I was going to do. There is a peculiar calm that comes after a decision you know you won't undo. Once the appointment with the handwriting analyst was set, I didn't feel urgency anymore. The frantic energy that people associate with taking action never arrived. Instead, everything slowed down. Not externally, life continued at its usual pace, but internally, the noise quieted. I was no longer debating whether. I was simply managing how. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy for its own sake. It's about preserving the integrity of a process before outside emotions contaminate it. I continued showing up exactly as I always had. I answered emails promptly. I attended meetings. I handled logistics around the trust with the same diligence that people had come to rely on. I was still the person who remembered deadlines and followed up with attorneys' offices when paperwork stalled. Still, the one who smoothed over scheduling conflicts and translated legal language into something my mother could absorb without fatigue. No one sensed a withdrawal because there wasn't one. That's the thing people misunderstand about silence when it's chosen deliberately. It doesn't look like distance. It looks consistent. And consistency is comforting. It reassures people that nothing has shifted, that the foundation beneath them is still stable. In truth, I was stabilizing something else entirely. Every interaction became an opportunity to observe without influencing. I listened to how confidently people spoke about decisions that had never been formally confirmed. I noted how often they referenced my mother's intent without citing her words. How often was her name used as an endorsement rather than a participation. I didn't correct them. A correction would have alerted them. Instead, I documented patterns. Who spoke on her behalf? Who deferred to whom? Which explanations were reused verbatim across months, even years? The repetition wasn't accidental. It was rehearsed, even if unconsciously. At the same time, I was careful not to overstep. There's a temptation, once you see the structure clearly, to tighten your grip too much, to gather everything, control everything, anticipate every outcome. But that kind of urgency creates tells. It makes people curious, suspicious. I did the opposite. I delegated where appropriate. I asked fewer questions than before. I became even more agreeable, even more neutral. I let small errors pass when they didn't matter. I focused only on what was essential. This wasn't disengagement. It was prioritization. Behind the scenes, I prepared for the moment when the analyst's assessment would exist independently of me. I thought carefully about timing, when such a finding would have the least chance of being dismissed as reactionary. I considered who needed to know first, and just as importantly, who did not. Power isn't about revealing everything at once. It's about sequencing. I didn't inform my family that I had consulted anyone. I didn't hint that I was looking into anything. There were no veiled comments, no emotional distance, no sudden firmness in my voice. If anything, I softened. I listened more patiently. I agreed more readily. People interpret that kind of behavior as acquiescence. They never consider that it might be containment. I was also careful with my mother. That was the hardest part. She trusted me. She had always trusted me. I didn't want to burden her with uncertainty or fear before there was something concrete to hold on to. Until the truth was externally validated, it remained an internal reckoning. I protected her from that weight, even as I carried it myself. In quieter moments, I reflected on how often silence is mischaracterized as fear. In reality, fear is loud. Fear rushes. Fear seeks reassurance. What I was doing now was none of those things. This was discipline. When the day of the analysis arrived, I didn't treat it like an event. I dressed as I always did. I brought only what was necessary, no dramatization, no emotional framing. I presented the documents without commentary, letting the materials speak. The analyst's work happened quickly, methodically, professionally, without suspense. I didn't hover. I didn't prompt. I waited, and when it was over, I didn't react. I thanked them. I accepted the written assessment. I asked one or two neutral procedural questions. Then I left. That was it. No confrontation, no announcement, no visible shift. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, I had crossed a threshold. I now held something that no longer depended on my interpretation, my memory, or my credibility within the family. The truth existed on paper, evaluated by someone with no stake in our dynamics. That changed everything. Still, I didn't move immediately, because once silence becomes strategic, you don't abandon it at the first opportunity. You use it to let circumstances align, to allow the system to continue behaving exactly as it has, long enough to make denial impossible. I understood that the consequences wouldn't arrive with a crash. They would arrive quietly, the way everything else had. Through confusion, through subtle disruption, through people realizing something was wrong before they understood what it was. And so I stayed where I was, reliable, present, and visible, moving in silence, not away from them, but past them. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They arrive as absences first. The first shift was administrative, subtle enough that no one could point to a single cause, but persistent enough to create discomfort. A document that had always been approved without question was suddenly flagged for verification. A routine process stalled, not dramatically, just long enough to become inconvenient. People noticed the delay. They didn't connect it to me. Why would they? I was still doing what I always did, answering emails, attending calls, offering help. But I had stopped compensating for weaknesses that weren't mine to cover. I followed procedures precisely, without smoothing over gaps or filling in assumptions. Precision changes outcomes. An attorney asked for clarification on execution dates. Another requested confirmation of consent that had previously been accepted informally. These weren't accusations. There were questions. The kind professionals ask when something doesn't align with protocol, and suddenly the room felt different. Conversations grew shorter. People paused before answering. The confidence that once carried explanations began to thin. No one said there's a problem, but everyone felt it. I watched from the same position I'd always occupied, close enough to observe, distant enough to avoid attribution. There was a quiet irony in this. For years, my attention to detail had been treated as unnecessary. Now, the absence of my informal corrections exposed how much the system had relied on them. Still, I said nothing. That silence unsettled them more than confrontation ever could. Without a clear challenge to respond to, there was nothing to defend against, only uncertainty. The trust, once spoken of as settled, became under review, not officially, not publicly, but in tone, in emails marked just to confirm, in meetings that were rescheduled rather than concluded. Loss doesn't always feel like collapse. Sometimes it feels like friction. I noticed how often my name began appearing again, this time not as a helper, but as a reference. Harper usually has this. Has Harper seen this? The irony wasn't lost on me. The credibility they had withheld was being sought retroactively, now that things were no longer smooth. But credibility, like trust, doesn't respond well to urgency. I remained calm, cooperative, neutral. I provided what was asked and nothing more. No commentary, no interpretation, just documentation. The real consequence wasn't procedural. It was psychological. People began to sense that something fundamental had shifted, even if they couldn't articulate what it was. The narrative they had relied on, that everything was fine, that the past was settled, no longer held effortlessly. It required reinforcement now, repetition, reassurance. And reassurance, when repeated too often, starts to sound like doubt. I saw it in the way people avoided eye contact when discussing timelines. In the way, explanations grew longer but less precise. In the meantime, meetings ended without conclusions. No one accused anyone. No one apologized. But the certainty was gone. That was the beginning. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like overcorrection. Once the delays became patterns, people started trying to fix things. Quietly at first. Extra emails, additional calls, requests for reassurance are framed as clarification. There was a sudden interest in documentation that had never mattered before. A desire to tighten things up, as if structure itself had somehow loosened on its own. I recognized the instinct immediately. They sensed exposure even if they didn't yet understand its source. What struck me was how instinctively the focus shifted away from my mother and toward the process. No one asked whether her consent had truly been established. They asked how to demonstrate that it had been, as if proof could be manufactured retroactively through enough coordination. That's when I knew it was too late. Because once professionals begin asking for verification, improvisation becomes risky. Every new explanation creates a trail. Every attempt to clarify adds language that can be compared, questioned, or contradicted. The system had moved out of narrative and into record. I watched people scramble gently, not openly, never openly. This was a family, after all. Panic here wore a polite face. Meetings were framed as check-ins. Concerns were disguised as efficiency improvements. But beneath the surface, something had fractured. Confidence. Someone suggested consolidating documents. Someone else proposed revisiting earlier amendments for completeness. And there was talk of bringing in additional counsel, as if more voices could stabilize something that was already misaligned at its core. No one asked me what I thought. They asked me what I had. That was new. I provided what existed. Clean copies, chronological lists, neutral summaries. I did not speculate. I did not explain the implications. I let the material speak, because by now it was speaking loudly enough on its own. I could see the moment when realization began to dawn, not all at once, but in fragments. A pause here, a delayed response there. The subtle recalculation that happens when people realize a story they've relied on may not survive scrutiny. Still, no one addressed the central issue. No one said the word signature out loud. That silence was telling. They were trying to fix the edges because the center was indefensible. They were hoping that enough procedural effort could compensate for a fundamental flaw. It couldn't. The analyst's assessment existed now. It wasn't circulating yet, but it didn't need to be. Its presence alone altered the terrain. It meant that any future claim about authenticity could be tested against an external standard. And standards don't bend for familiarity. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold, only a kind of sober clarity. This was what inevitability looked like. Not dramatic exposure, but the slow collapse of plausible deniability. I thought briefly about stepping in, about offering a path forward that might soften the impact. But that would have required me to resume the role I had finally stepped out of, the one who absorbed discomfort to protect others from consequence. I didn't do that, because by the time people are trying to fix what they should have examined years ago, they're not looking for the truth. They're looking for escape, and there wasn't one. The confrontation didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in a small conference room, with neutral walls and a table that was slightly too large for the number of people seated around it. No one raised their voice. No one accused anyone else directly. It was, in many ways, exactly how I had imagined it would be. Controlled, careful, restrained. I was asked to attend for clarity. That phrasing mattered. It acknowledged, finally, that clarity was something I possessed. The handwriting analyst's assessment was introduced without commentary. Just a document placed on the table, its conclusion stated plainly. No embellishment, no dramatic language. A professional opinion, grounded in form and consistency, explaining that the signature in question could not have been produced by someone with my mother's documented physical limitations. There was a long pause. People read, reread, adjusted their posture. Someone cleared their throat. Another person asked a procedural question that had nothing to do with the content of the assessment. It was a familiar move, deflection through logistics. I didn't interrupt. When someone finally spoke, it wasn't to challenge the findings. It was to ask how this had come to light. Not whether it was accurate, but how it had been discovered. That, more than anything, told me the truth had landed. I answered simply, through documentation. No elaboration, no narrative. There was an attempt, brief, restrained, to reframe, to suggest that intentions had been good. Those circumstances had been complicated, that everyone had been doing their best at the time. I listened. I didn't argue, because intent was no longer relevant. What mattered now was that a legal instrument relied on a physical act that could not have occurred. That fact stood on its own, unmoved by context or character. When I did speak again, it was only to clarify next steps, not demands, not consequences, just process, review, correction. My mother was quiet throughout, tired but attentive. When she finally spoke, it was not to express anger. It was to confirm something simply and unmistakably. She had not signed the document. That ended the discussion. There was no apology, no dramatic admission, just a collective understanding that something fundamental would need to be addressed, and that it could not be undone quietly. I felt no surge of triumph, only relief. The truth was no longer mine to protect. After the truth was acknowledged, life didn't transform overnight. There were follow-up meetings, revisions, professional conversations are conducted with a new level of caution. The trust entered a corrective process that moved slowly, deliberately, and with oversight that had been absent before. It wasn't dramatic. It was appropriate. What changed most wasn't the system. It was me. For the first time, I was no longer carrying a role that required my silence to function. I didn't need to be the quiet stabilizer, the invisible buffer between discomfort and resolution. The responsibility I had once absorbed by default had shifted where it belonged. People spoke to me differently after that, not warmer, not colder, just more carefully. They listened when I asked questions. They paused before answering. The assumption of my compliance had been replaced with something closer to respect. I hadn't demanded it. I had demonstrated it. My relationship with my mother also changed, in ways that were subtle but meaningful. She trusted me before. Now she understood why. There was no bitterness between us, no sense of betrayal that needed to be healed. Just an acknowledgement that her reality had finally been aligned with the records that governed it. I didn't feel powerful. I felt complete. The part of me that had once minimized itself to preserve harmony no longer needed to exist. Not because I had become louder or harder, but because I had become precise. There is a difference between shrinking and choosing stillness. I still listen more than I speak. I still notice things others overlook. But now, I no longer assume that my observations are optional. I don't rush to explain them away for the comfort of others. That has changed how I move through every space. I am no longer invisible to myself, and that, more than any external validation, is what endures. When people talk about justice, they often imagine noise. They imagine confrontation, exposure, a moment where someone finally wins. But that isn't what justice felt like in this story. Justice felt like alignment, like the quiet relief of knowing that what was written down finally matched what had always been true. Nothing about this ending is cinematic. No one was publicly shamed. No relationships were theatrically destroyed. There was no revenge, no celebration, no sense of having defeated anyone. What there was instead was correction, slow, procedural, and irreversible. And that mattered more. For a long time, I believed that staying quiet made me smaller, that every moment I chose restraint over confrontation, I was erasing myself a little more. What I learned is that silence isn't inherently weak. It only becomes weak when it's unchosen, when it's the result of fear rather than intention. Chosen silence is different. Chosen silence watches. It learns. It waits until the truth can stand without being carried. The handwriting analyst didn't create the truth. They didn't save anyone. They simply confirmed what already existed in a language the system could no longer ignore. That distinction is important. Power didn't come from exposure. It came from preparation. I also learned something harder. Being the reliable one can be dangerous if no one ever listens to you. Reliability, without authority turns people into infrastructure. Useful, essential, and invisible. The moment I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill, those gaps became visible to everyone else. That wasn't cruelty. It was honesty. I don't tell this story to suggest that silence is always the answer, or that patience guarantees justice. Many people wait their entire lives and are never heard. What made the difference here wasn't endurance. It was clarity. The willingness to stop doubting what I knew and to act in a way that didn't require anyone's permission. Today I'm still quiet by nature, still observant, still measured, but I no longer confuse peace with self-erasure. I understand now that some truths don't need to be shouted. They need to be placed, carefully, where they cannot be ignored. If you've listened this far, I want to leave you with one question, not to provoke, but to reflect. In your own life, is your silence protecting you, or protecting a story that no longer deserves to exist? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not just about what happened here, but about the moments in your own life where quiet observation eventually changed something, internally or externally. Thank you for listening.